The game is the old 3M Mr. President. Now, this is one of my favorite political games of all, and it's a little lighter than... I have quite a few different political games. This one's a little lighter than most of them, but I think it plays very, very, very well. Let's take a look at how the game is, how the rules are set up and how the game works. Okay, first of all, there's kind of a basic game, which is the core rules of the game. They're very, very simple, but then you start adding, you know, some of the optional rules: advertising, fundraising, debates, this, that, and the other. And it gets to be almost, you know, a kind of moderate complexity game, but still very light. Now let's see what happens. It can handle 4 players, and that's how I'm, of course, playing it. Solitaire. It can also be played as a 2-player game. I actually prefer playing it as a 4-player game. Even when you're playing a 2-player game, the decisions are a little harder to make in the 4-player game. But in a 2-player game, you'd combine your hands is kind of the issue. Now let's take a look at what the setup kind of is. So each character card is one of the candidates, either a presidential candidate or a vice presidential candidate from one of the 2 major parties. And you have the 2 different... In a 4-player game, you'd have 1 different player for each of the candidates. And the presidential deck has more powerful cards in general than the vice presidential deck. All right. So on a particular card, you have a number of values. Campaign ability is going to be the size of the hand that the player is able to hold. Financial support, that's the amount of cash available for advertising at the start of the game, and that's going to be in millions of dollars. Press support, this affects if you get some sort of endorsement. The higher the number, the better your endorsement. Fundraising, your ability to raise more money for advertising generally tends to be a very, very non-valuable thing to do. Advertising is great, but trying to raise the funds to do more of it is almost impossible. Advertising itself is going to affect how effective you will be at the advertising. Effective total adds everything up. It lists the state that you're from and the electoral votes. Now, this is kind of the period I'm used to for elections, and the electoral votes, not that I'm from this era necessarily, but the electoral votes feel like the natural ones to me. And it's odd to see them nowadays, but anyway, you're at an earlier period here where New York State still matters and California doesn't mean quite as much. It's still huge. And then you have topics that one can debate on. And the player or players choose who's going to be their presidential candidate, who's going to be their vice presidential candidate. In the pure 2-player rules, it matters a lot less. In the 4-player rules, you want your presidential candidate to be significantly better, especially in campaign ability, because the presidential cards are more valuable and he's going to get more of them. All right, let's look at how a turn works. But there's some kind of cute aspects here. So the core idea on a turn, and we can look at some of the options, etc., to see what happens, is you pick up your cards and you look at them. Hey, we haven't discussed these. What's up with these? Okay. So these always, except for a couple of exceptions, the home state cards, which are sort of a special case, have 4 different colored values on them. And those will be a number followed by a state. The number is the number of votes that's worth. The state is the state that the votes will be cast in. These are going to be proportions so that high-numbered cards only show up in the big states, but as you can see, even states like New York, and there's probably, might have a 1 or a 2, I mean, they have very small votes as well. So there's a whole span of different kind of votes that you could have here. So anyway, you look at your hand and you decide upon which region you want to concentrate on. Red, blue, green, or brown. And the votes are concentrated mainly in the East and the Midwest in this. Of course, California is a big victory state. It's got a lot of electoral votes, but the rest of the West is pretty sparse. And the South has actually got a decent number of electoral votes in some of the states, but not a whole lot overall. Okay. What you do is you roll the 2 dice after declaring which region you're going to be in, and you look at the numbers. This will mean that you can campaign in state 1, 5, and then the sum of 6. 1, 5, and 6, let's say I went in the East, would be Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and New York. And that means I look through my hand and I can pick as many cards for Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and New York that I like, set them aside for a moment, and think about, well, can I cast these or not? And the answer to whether or not you can cast them is filling in these boxes. Every card that you cast to vote at this point, you have to make a mark on your tally board under your I'm sorry, there's like music coming from outside that I'm confused by. Under your party, and once you've filled all the marks and all the boxes in your state, you can't throw cards in there anymore. Which obviously means you want to concentrate the cards that matter. In New York State, you probably don't want to throw little cards unless you've got some other reason. Well, let's take a look at some special cases and special rules. Alright. And there are a lot of these, and they make it kind of difficult. Now, some of them are part of the advanced game, and some of them are not. In particular, let's look at how the campaign's going to end. So, there's a finite deck of cards here, and it's not all that much larger, proportionally than the hand size. And as you play votes, you'll be drawing new cards from your deck. Now, in the 2-player game, the 2 decks are combined, and you'll be drawing a large hand. But in the 4-player game, the president draws only from the presidential deck. But when he runs out, he starts drawing from the vice presidential deck. Now, if they completely run out, you've entered something called the home stretch. And from then on, both players are allowed to pick 2 regions to campaign in each turn. And that just widens their choice of states to drop cards in. Okay. When someone runs out of cards and can't replenish, I believe everybody else gets 1 turn, one chance to use their cards, and then all the cards go to this, which is the undecided voter stack. At the beginning of the game, there's 3 cards from each deck in there. All right. Those are going to be split up, and that's going to be at the beginning. At the basic game, those are split up based on who went to the most states in an electoral vote. And that'll be whoever has the most states with a mark in them. I don't really remember the popular game voting, or the popular vote game. I think it's got the same rules. There's a slight difference as to where you can cast your votes. Okay, so whoever went to the most states gets that many cards off the top of here. The difference between them. So if I went to five states and you went to 3, I would get the top 2 cards. Then I get the first of the next, and we alternate from there. The cards that you have in your hand there can be dropped in any region you like And in the electoral vote game, you don't have to mark them here. In the popular vote game, you do. Okay. Going to campaign headquarters. In the event that you roll an 11 or doubles, and those numbers are going to be able to allow you to do a lot of other things, you're able to go to your character's home state. Whatever that is. You can cast any cards you have for your home state, and you can cast their home state cards there. I believe these don't have to be marked, but I may be wrong. Okay, yeah, the home state ballot card cast in this fashion doesn't have to be marked. All the others do. Now, after you've done that, you're able to draw a card off the top of this kind of campaign headquarters stack. And that's going to give some positive, negative effects. There are things like miss a turn, but there are also things like press endorsements, which allow you to draw from the undecided voter stack and cast votes based on your press rating over a certain level of criteria, wider or lesser, and I believe that your opponent replenishes the deck there. I always have to look all these things up. Now each player has to replenish the deck, so everybody in turn, starting with your opponent, passes cards until the deck is fully replenished. But you're able to use some of your opponent's cards through the undecided voter deck to cast your own votes, and then that puts those cards in here, which is at risk for later. Okay. In the event that you absolutely cannot play any cards when you've rolled the dice and campaigned, you've blundered, and you lose a card to the undecided voter deck, and then you automatically go home, and you get the same home state advantage. You can't pretend to blunder. There's nothing that stops you from cheating, but if you have a possible play, you must make it. Okay. So now, let's briefly look at some of the advanced game rules. There are really a couple. Nomination is just, hey, give me more character cards and I'll select a couple. It's not like there's a real game for this. Advertising. Okay, advertising is a nice little option. You have to roll 7 or doubles to use this. After you've chosen your regions, or region. And if you do so, what you can do is you can take a number of cards equal to your advertising rating from the top of the undecided voter deck, and then you kind of pay a price listed here to drop any cards into the state listed. Now, you have to, so remember, a card in a region specifies a state. Well, if you pay for Maryland, you can drop as many cards that say Maryland in there for that one price, and you mark the advertising column. You can never advertise in that state again. Now, do you have to mark these votes? This is always the question. What do you mark? What do you not? Yes, you have to mark the votes. Okay. So you have to have never advertised there before, the money, and the spaces to mark on an advertising run. Fundraising is, well, when you pay your money, you pay it out of your initial financial support, which you keep track of down here. And you might run out. Now, running out means that you roll on this fundraising table. You can take a specific action to fundraise in a region. You roll as you would normally, I believe, and pick a state out of those that came up on your roll. You have to put a check mark for fundraising in that state's column. And then you get a roll here based on the state's electoral votes, your fundraising rating, and a number on the dice. And to tell you the truth, you don't get a lot of money. Even if you get an excellent large state somehow, you have very strong fundraising, you're not going to get very much. The most you can pull in is really enough for one advertising run. And that's in California alone. Or New York as well. New York's at 41. Yeah. So that's if you hit New York or California. If you start getting down here, you're going to have to fundraise twice to advertise once. And what I found with this game is you want to get through your deck quickly. That's more important than trying to get that little edge of pulling undecided voter cards. Now, advertising, unlike let me make sure. Yeah, advertising, unlike the going to campaign headquarters, your direct opponent has to replenish the deck, the undecided voter deck. So you're taking cards directly from your opponent. Anyhow, fundraising is probably not very valuable because what is valuable is debating. On debating, you have to face your particular opponent. So a president has to face a president. And you choose an issue, which need not be one you're identified with, but that gives you an advantage. And then you must risk, if you're the challenger, a card in each region. The defender has to risk, based on their debate rating, the number of total issues that they're identified with. They have an option how much they want to risk. And what you're going to do is you're going to roll dice. And if you get the number required for your debate rating, you have succeeded that in the debate. If you have the particular issue and you're associated with it, you get to roll twice. And 2 victories beats 1 victory, okay? Now, if one person gets more victories than the other, they take the cards that their opponent has placed in various regions, move them to their own region, and then they look at the cards and they have the option of whether or not to mark them. They can slip them in without marking them, which you want to do in a lot of cases. But in some cases, there's hard to reach states, and you want to get those votes marked to count for your end of game. Remember, the more states marked gets more of these. These cards are selected by the players, no more than 1 per region, at the beginning of the debate before they know whether or not they're going to win. But they have some idea. And they can put them in any region, and they'll be in the state that's listed in that region. Debates can be very, very powerful, and on top of these other effects of them, if one person's won more debates than the other, they get the top 5 cards from here before the state comparison takes place. That's a powerful swing. Quite often, the undecided voter stack is completely played out by the debates and the difference in states visited. If people are trying to stay even on those, though, it's possible that you could end up dealing them out. They also have rules on an incumbent year. I'll hit this I'm not doing this one, but you play out with these built-in edges here. Now let me explain built-in edge, because that's the weird thing. What happens if you tie in a state, essentially? Well, when you tie in the total votes added up in cards, and that's just the numbers on the cards in a state. In the normal game, one side or the other has a number listed in these columns for every state. And all that really means is the state that has a number wins it in case of a tie. These are all in fractions of votes, actually. So for example, this 20 is actually 0.2. This 5 is 0.05. Well, over here with the incumbent edge, some of these are a little higher. For example, take a look at New York's 200. That counts as 2 full votes. Now, there are some problems with this, which is it doesn't handle what you do in the case of a tie now. I tend to give it to the guy with the built-in edge, the incumbent. I think they may actually specify that there. The incumbent wins all ties or something. No. Alright. One issue with the game that I've seen, there's no way of handling a tie. It's possible to tie in the electoral votes, and what will happen in this case is it gets thrown into the House of Representatives. Because there's, at the same time as this, an election going on in the House of Representatives, well, what difference is there between the votes that a president casts and what's going into the House of Representatives? Well, in some cases, a popular House member may get returned even if his area votes against his party and for a different presidential candidate. So there's no absolute answer here. The one that I used, though, was to count up the number of states. But that's actually sort of the opposite of what should be used. Because representation in that case is based more on the number of representatives is less on the number of states than the Electoral College. The Electoral College adds the 2 senators to every state. So for example, something like Rhode Island, well, maybe Rhode Island's not the best choice, but something like Vermont has only 3 electoral votes. Well, it has only 1 representative. So I think the answer would be to actually subtract the number of states that each side won from the Electoral College vote. The guy who won the less states would win the election then. Anyway, I had it happen once, didn't know quite what to do, and it wouldn't be a big deal normally, except if you're playing this as a campaign where you're using the incumbencies, and it's a nice fast-paced little game, so it actually it's quite possible to run off, 3 or 4 of these in a couple hours, and maybe, over a few days, just really run through the whole deck of candidates. All right, I'll load this up.